Hello, Steve. How are you, sir?
I'm up and down like a fiddler's elbow, fella. How are you?
Well, I'm a bit worried, you know. I'm actually worried about the calendar. I just bought it. It's days, you know. They're numbered.
Oh, not.
Ain't
Oh,
gonna-
well, we're talking about a calendar as in a day, not a colander.
No, no. You never see one of those in my hands.
No, probably not.
No, it's odd, right? The calendar.
Yeah.
So, sept is 7, isn't it?
Yes.
Oct is 8.
Yes.
Nove, 9.
Yes.
Decade, 10.
Yes.
September, October, November, December. Yeah, they're the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months. They're not.
No, they're not. It's designed to fool you, just to trick you.
Yeah.
It's all designed to lull you into a false sense of security about the world.
It's bizarre.
Yes, it's very.
And did you know all the seasons are named after coils of metal? Well, except winter and summer and autumn. But there is spring.
Well, there you go. That's okay then. At least we've sprung forward into spring.
That's right. So the calendar, and we use the calendar a lot, don't we?
Yeah.
Specifically the AD calendar, but that's coming into misabuse because people don't want to use AD anymore. So I thought perhaps we can talk about the calendar overall and how it all started.
And that sounds a very potentially long and winding road to discuss. But my first question then, Mark, is why don't people want to use the term AD anymore?
Well, let's consider what it means. It means Anno Domini. It's actually, to give it its proper full title, Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi, the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, historically, that's what it's always been. But of course, as soon as you put down our Lord and Jesus, as you know in this modern world, unless you're Christian, people object to that. And let us be plainly obvious here. A lot of people aren't Christian, and a lot of people don't use the Christian calendar. I know you like using AD, and in academic terms, I got used to using CE, the Common Era.
I think I like to continue to use it because it is anti-authoritarian and it is anti the system of the day. And I'm a bit of a rebel. So I think that's primarily why I like to use it. It's sticking two fingers up at at what the world is doing.
Yeah.
So
If we go back to year 1,
yeah.
there's a couple of things that I think we should lay out. And it's really the fact that at the time, no one knew it existed. This was not invented until the year 525. So although we will look back, we'll say, oh, so-and-so lived in the year 38 AD. Well, they didn't know that. They never used it. They were using the Roman dating system or wherever they were in the world. So in a way, we do a disservice to people in the past because although I agree AD is the most appropriate, if you're looking at the Western world, that calls into a question a few things, certainly for the first few centuries, because not everybody was the majority of following Christ for those first 2 centuries. They were big and they were going to get bigger and bigger. But also, it wasn't used. It would be similar to someone 200, 300, 400 years from now, looking back and saying, Mark and Steve, currently when they were recording this episode, it was the year 7 after coronavirus, AC, their new dating system. But of course, that means nothing to us.
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. David Ewing Duncan said that there was no universally recognised year 1 in contemporary records, which is right. You know, there wasn't a year 1. It's interesting that the Western world, and however it decided to do that, was anchoring itself around this pivotal point of the birth of this man, Yeshua, this man Jesus. And it's also interesting to note that the Hebrew calendar, under which Jesus would have been born and raised, is still tracking on now, and I think they're in around 5,700, 5,800 from the time of whenever they started their calendar. And I'm not 100% sure when that was. I would imagine it would have been from around the time of Abraham, maybe before that. I'm not 100% sure. So there is the Jewish calendar under which Jesus was born, and then there is the Western calendar, BC, AD, as it always used to be divided, from when we recognise this unique birth of this unique God-man. You are still anchoring your dating system on him, whether you call it CE or BCE. It's still anchored on him.
Yeah.
It's not CE and then you're dating it from 100 years after Christ. You're still anchoring it on the birth of Christ. You're just calling it a different name because you don't like God.
You are correct. And again, it's like a false premise to use CE, the Common Era. And before Christ, it was BCE, before the Common Era. It's just basically saying we can use this system because we don't want to refer to a religious person. And you can say it was probably done for good reasons. There were probably people, perhaps even Jews or Hindus, who got an even older calendar, saying, well, you keep referring to a person who we don't follow. Well, that's not the point. It's like you don't set the rules of football and then decide 500 years later you're not going to call it football anymore. It'll be called pitchball. People getting upset with the word foot. There's some people without feet. So it's just nonsense to suddenly want to change a system that had been applied and used by that stage for at least 1,000, possibly more years, 1,500 years by the time modern academia, again, Victorian, the rise of atheism and science, as though they were joint together, using. And I think it's a false way in looking at the dating system.
So, if I've got this right, and I'm very happy to be corrected here, Dionysius Exiguus, in the 6th century, is the one who brought in that moniker of the year of our Lord, right? So for the first 600 years. So from the time, how were they marking the calendar then? What were they using in the West?
So it's AUC, Ab Urbe Condita, after the founding of the city of Rome. And this is important for the calendar and the spread of Christianity. So by the time that Jesus comes along, whenever year he was born, because there's no evidence to say he was born in the year 1, let's assume that the biggest empire of that time could spread very quickly what his followers wanted to do. So in a way, it's a divinely inspired and instigated time to happen. If it had happened 2 or 3 centuries before, we probably wouldn't have heard of him as quickly. But the time and the place was ripe. But they were using a different system, and it was to the founding of Rome. And I think by the year 1, it was 753 AUC after the founding of Rome. But they were using the consular system. So even when the emperors were around, they still dated by 2 consuls that at that point were just figureheads and absolutely no worth whatsoever. They didn't date it by the emperor. But, and you're right, the modern Bulgaria, where Dionysius Exiguus lived, I don't know what probably Dacia, the Roman province, he had enough with the Emperor Diocletian, and he wanted to fix the major Christian events out of his orbit, but may have missed out by 2 or 3 years.
Right. Okay. Well, that fills us in a little bit of a backdrop there then. So that's how we sort of ended up with our calendar that we understand, whether you call it AD or whether you call it CE, irrespective, it's still dating from the same time as Christ.
Yeah, it was the Julian calendar at that point. So Julius Caesar had come in and specifically made it a 7-day week. Because until then, it was a 9-day week. What was the joke? The Romans only went to the market once per week because that was enough for them. Thank you, Steve.
That's it. I hear you.
Yeah, but it was a 9-day week, and the reason was because people couldn't get to the markets every 7 days. They needed a little bit longer because of travel. So it was 9, but Julius comes along and fixed it more in line, what's called intercalary, with the movement of the sun. It would then change under Gregorius, the Pope. The Gregorian calendar is what we still use, and that was the 16th century, or whatever it was.
It was about 1600, wasn't it?
I think it was, yeah. I'll have to look that up.
1700?
Yeah, that's right. So, in effect, it was the Julian calendar at the time.
So what was going on? What was kicking off in AD 1?
Oh, well,
What was happening, man?
Well, interestingly, China did a census, and they reckoned they counted anything up to 57 million people. And Rome was the biggest city. It had more than 1 million people. The big slum area, the Suburra, would have been teeming with the likes of me and you, going down to the little vendors, getting our food. What was it, Brutus? He said, how many hot dogs did you eat on the way to the Forum Caesar? And he turned around and said, et tu, Brutus.
Et tu.
And,
absolutely, like any true Yorkshireman would speak it. So with China, then, I mean, that's quite interesting, because that would have been around the sort of the flourishing of the Han Dynasty in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Han Dynasty was under Emperor Ping. Emperor Ping was the emperor of the Han Dynasty at that time, and he was expanding.
Not Ming.
Not Ming, but Ping. Not Pong, but Ping. Not Ping Pong, even, but Emperor Ping. And Emperor Ping was expanding his influence, and one of the great historians, Sima Qian, in his record of the Grand Historian, he documents how the Chinese were exploring out all of these new trade connections with the West through the Silk Road in around about 1 AD. So while we have a very Western European-centric view of what was actually going on in the world, there was so much other stuff happening. So many other things kicking
Mayan
off
calendar
in so many different other parts of the world in 1 AD. As you say, and not only that, you've got the Parthian Empire.
Yep.
You know, the Parthian Empire, one of which was Rome's eastern rival, sort of coming out of what is modern day
Syria, still is.
Yeah, you know, and that was at its height in about 1 AD, which is why the whole arrival of the Magi at the birth of Jesus is so very interesting to explore. And Parthia's control of the trade routes, especially around that Silk Road area, made it a very formidable power in the East, vying with the Roman Empire.
Yes, vying, but also trading.
Yeah.
That's why then you need a common calendar over time. Because when you're spending months getting like from China to Europe on the Silk Road, you don't need an exact date when things are going to arrive. But when it got to the point, and it's probably round about the time the Gregorian calendar came in, you need more fixity, more certainty of dates, especially if you're expecting ships to come in because of underwriting. In fact, The Merchant of Venice is all about that Shakespeare's play, that Antonio is waiting ships to come in and they're late and he has to give the money and his pound of flesh, supposedly, to Shylock. So they needed more exactitude, and this is why calendars are so important, because you can agree when things are leaving and when it's expected to arrive. You can't do that if you've got competing different calendars. And the Romans knew this. This is why they introduced standard weights and measures throughout the empire and a dating system, so that they could guarantee that if something's leaving Rome, and they roughly know how long it would take by ship to get to the Holy Land, when's it going to arrive? Because if it's late, there may be a problem. So interesting that you mentioned Parthia and all that, because although we see them as continually politically being at odds, on the lower ground, the average person, they weren't.
No, and they often acted as like intermediaries as well between the Romans and the Han Empire, the Chinese Han dynasty. So they were doing quite a fair bit of stuff, sort of laying the groundwork for that sort of interconnectedness, which obviously was helping to facilitate and lay that groundwork for globalization, as we know today, really, long before the modern era. They were networking really well. And the Parthians were also, separated from Rome by the state of Judea. And Judea was like a buffer state where Herod was reigning. And that was a buffer state, if you like. So the Romans had established themselves towards the west. They'd put this buffer state of Judea between them and the Parthian Empire further over to the east. And that meant that it gave them opportunity to gather their forces in the event that the Parthians decided to rock up.
The role of women at this time, and that they had no rights in the Roman Empire. Although they had no rights, they are writ large in the story of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, because no one was ever going to listen to the witness of a woman.
Not at all.
Let alone a couple of them who made out they found something with the rock rolled over and all that. So the fact that the whole world discounted women, and yet this book didn't try to hide that in the accounts that was written about the life of Jesus.
It is, and it was so countercultural to involve women in the narrative. I mean, if you wanted to make something up so that you wanted people to believe that it was true, the very last thing that you would do would be include the witness or testimony of a woman in your account. Because to include a witness or testimony from a woman would be to negate the truth or the validity of the claim that you're making, particularly within the Jewish faith at that time. The testimony of a woman wasn't worth anything, absolutely nothing. And so the first people to see the risen, ascended Christ are women. The first people to spread the good news of his resurrection are women. The people that support his ministry are women. There is so much, if you actually understand the way that Christianity elevates the role of woman and womanhood, is quite staggering in terms of progressiveness. because you would not write a woman into the script if you're trying to convince somebody it was true. Unless, of course, it happened to be true and women happened to be the witnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's in its favour. Jesus had a brother, and that there were many children in that family. That in itself is something that's always overlooked, because one of the unfortunate aspects of the year one is that the average infant mortality rate was 75%. Only a quarter of children ever got beyond their 5th birthday. That's the world in which people were living. And you can imagine the psychological trauma that, well, perhaps life was a bit more different back then, but it would have some psychological trauma on people.
Yeah, even if life was different, it doesn't mean to say that the loss that you feel is different. Yes. It's not like, oh, let's pop out another baby and it doesn't matter if it lives or dies. I think that the trauma and the grief that you would feel at the loss of one of your offspring is the same as it has always been. Humanity has not changed in that regard. We're just very, very fortunate that we live in the world where today most ladies, particularly in the West, do not have those sort of traumas in childbirth. I mean, my daughter recently, when she had one of her daughters, she was very fortunate that she had that baby in this era, because had she had that baby 50 years ago, she would have died.
Yeah.
And so we are very blessed, very fortunate to be living in the era that we are and to have the medical intervention. But had my daughter have lost that baby 50 years ago, the trauma for her would have been exactly the same as the trauma would be for her today. We are the same. Humans are the same, and so I don't think high mortality rate is something that would have been horrific for the people. Can you imagine the amount of people back in the day there who would have been suffering from what we now call PTSD or something like that? So many people would have been suffering from what we have now clocked in our modern era as some sort of post-traumatic stress. And it's little wonder, but they would have had no outlet for it. They would have had nobody to walk alongside them, to wrap around them, to help them out. They would have got on with it and lived their lives carrying that burden without ever being able to unpack it properly. We're very fortunate, I think, in the era that we live. And we all know we've talked about what era would you like to live in the past. And so I think that we're very fortunate to live where we live and to live in the era that we live in, where we have these incredible scenes of progress within the world that we're living in. It's great.
But like you said before, yes, it is good. But that doesn't mean that the people of the past were stupid or couldn't look after themselves.
Not at all.
I'm glad you brought up the fact that they were like us, because I wrote down here, they were us back then.
Totally.
And they had hopes and dreams just like we did.
Yep.
And interestingly, about this era, I touched on it earlier, and the calendar is part of it. It gave this sense of unity throughout a part of the world that ordinarily it wouldn't have. Yes, there were the Roman overlords, and no one wants to be, under a tyranny.
Yeah.
But they did, and I'm mirroring Monty Python here. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, all these things, if that's what you want. But it also permitted a swift release or his followers to go out and spread this message, and it completely altered history, which we date from 1 AD onwards. That couldn't have happened, but more importantly, and I made a note here, one of the big developments of this era, we're starting to see the rise of the modern book for the first time, probably 50, 60 years either side. The reason that was one that I think it was Byblos, wasn't it, in modern Beirut, where they started to put it together as we would recognize a modern book rather than a scroll or a tablet. That revolutionized the passing or the passage of a message. But there would have been people who wanted it. You can come up with as many ideas you want, but if no one buys into it or gets it, they're not going to be known. And the fact that books absolutely exploded tells you that this message that eventually would change history, in other words, the message of Christ, was wanted. And you only have to study a little bit of the life at that time to understand why.
Absolutely right. The whole message of Christ, the whole story of Christ, is so foundational to Western civilization that we remove him and his message at our peril, because we actually undermine the very foundations upon which much of our civilization has been built. we would be wise to recognise and understand why the foundations have been laid the way that they have been laid, rather than just trying to pull them up. I think that would be something very wise to do, because if you undermine the foundations of the house collapses.
Yeah.
And I see around Western European nations who are continually undermining the person of Christ as the foundation upon which their nations were formed and built and all the rest of it.
It gets my goat when I see modern adaptations of books, or even books written specifically about the Tudor period, which are very much of interest in the English-speaking world, as dramas. But they completely almost suck out any mention of God. But that does an immense disservice to people who lived at that time, because for them, God was a presence in the corner.
Yep.
They could not imagine life without it. We only have this false separating of God and life, really in the rise of science in the 19th century. And we shouldn't do that.
No, we shouldn't.
And anybody who's interested in history, if anyone's listening to this because they've seen AD 1, then you're going to have an interest in the past. And therefore, you've got to understand what the past included. And it was always God.
It is part of the most significant context that you need to be able to understand the culture within. And if you take away that contextual setting, you are left with something that does not resonate and is not actually what it would have been.
A lot of history, especially the period we're talking about now, just focuses on dead buildings.
Yeah.
And bricks and mortar, as though that tells you about the Roman Empire. No, it doesn't. It doesn't tell you anything about what people thought, how they lived their lives, what was important to them, and why.
Yeah, absolutely. And this era that we're talking about, sort of 1 AD as we've termed it, this was an era where there was a whole range of various religious, various philosophical movements, including Stoicism, which were moving widespread. Seneca the Younger, who was a prominent Stoic philosopher, was alive during that time, and he would later influence the Christian thought about lots of things. You know, there was stuff which was bubbling along, which was being brought up to the surface, which was all adding to the incredibly rich weave of the tapestry as it was being threaded together and woven together throughout the Roman Empire and out obviously into what is the Western world. So yeah, there was some incredible strands being pulled, and there was a lot of stuff going on that really added, built up, solidified, whatever term you want to use for it, the thickness, the depth of what we were going to later see. So you cannot just dismiss all this stuff just because you don't like it, don't agree with it. You can't do that.
You can't. People do,
I
and
know
of
they
course
do.
then they've got a fragile house with no foundation. You're right to talk about the Stoics, because this is a world in which humans really battled with existence and what's it for and what is existence and why are we here. And I think you mentioned before that the Greek way of looking at the gods, these capricious men and women with their willingness to constantly interfere or side with certain peoples, which you read in Homer, was starting to lose in the interest of people. And they were craving for something more, well, what did you say, tasting, when you talk to your parishioners? That you want to give them something substantial to chew on and eat rather than just sugary. That's what they wanted.
Yeah. And it's into that sort of environment that upsteps the God-man.
Yeah.
You know, who is there, who is not capricious, who is not subject to the whims of humanity and the actions of rogue gods roaming the earth. You get this. All of these things, I think, as I say, are hints, remezes, hints of the things to come. And
you may have to explain what remez is.
Yeah, so a remez is just a sort of rabbinical term for a hint of something. So within the scripture, you have the 4 ways of interpreting the scripture. You have the pashat, which is the sort of plain literal meaning. You have the drash, which is the homily that you can make, the sermon you can make out of it. You have the remez, which is a hint of something. So as you read the text, it's giving you a hint that there's a deeper truth there. And then you have the sot, which is the secret or the hidden thing, which is tucked away in the text, which will be illuminated at the appropriate time to you. So 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 a remez, and I think all of the gods, all of the stories of the gods, they're all hints, they're all pointers, they're all signposts. So you think of a remez as a little signpost pointing you towards something. And it's within that circle, within that great Greek-Roman influence, that you get the rise of this one man who the world's focus turns on, and who the Romans mock the Christians for believing in, because the Christians are referred to as atheists because they believe a man is God. How could they possibly do that, those atheists? The irony is not lost.
That might confuse people listening to that. The first 2-3 centuries of Christianity, the Christians were known as atheists. So the way to explain that is think of Socrates at his trial in ancient Athens. It's not that he mocked the gods. He said he's got other things to go on. So he was accused of impiety and corrupting the youth. So he was found guilty and he had to take the hemlock. The impiety is atheos. So you are a theist if you believe in the gods, in this case, of Athens. If you don't, you're atheos. You can still be religious. And for the Christians, they didn't accept the gods of Olympus. So they were atheists.
Yeah, I know.
People forget that. It just shows you we get wrapped up too much perhaps in words and such. But that is a crux point that's coming, that the first century was really all about, wasn't it? Suddenly things changed.
And the Roman Empire, with its massive spread, was the perfect vehicle to carry that message of this first century Jewish rabbi westwards. And obviously it's travelled eastwards as well, but certainly the predominant stride out was west.
Yeah.
Fascinating first mark up on the calendar, really.
Amazing. And again, the whole point of history is it's always full of drama. Although strangely, when you look at the details about the first century, there's a severe lack of it. You don't get many things happening because it wasn't written about.
No. And you're right, and this is the thing, isn't it? That and I think you were right to point it out, that back then in the first century, people were just like you and me. They had their hopes, they had their dreams. They would meet up down at the local tavern or whatever it was. Yeah. They would chat in the marketplace. They would talk about buying land and sowing crops and raising children and having families in exactly the same way as we do today. We just do it in slightly different settings. I think that one of the greatest things that I have discovered over the years, the more I read, the more I investigate, is that humanity has not changed. And it doesn't matter what civilization you're in. Yeah, there'll be different cultural contexts to things. But at the root of it all, at the heart of it all, none of us have changed. We're all the same.
It's like a guy went back to Rome in a time machine, and he was a portly man, and he needed some clothes, and he went into a shop and he said, "You got any togas XL?" And he said, "Why do you need so many?"
Your jokes, Mark, I wish were getting better.
They won't.
But by and large, they're not.
No. Thanks a lot. So faithful years then. So 1 AD is definitely a faithful year. I assume we'll do others moving forward.
Maybe we will.
Would you like to be alive then? Would you like to go back and see it?
Oh, I'd love to go back and see it. I wouldn't want to stay there. It's like any time in history, right? Because we read all of this stuff and we read all sorts of people's insights and we go, wow, that's incredible. But you're going, actually, you weren't there either. So how much of this is narrative gloss from the author and how much of this is actually likely? And I think, and I'm more inclined to think this as I get older, that we haven't actually got a clue.
No.
And that if we were to get on a time machine and go back, we would be gobsmacked at how wrong we've got it all.
Well, you said something, I mean, this wouldn't be year 1. This would probably be the year 30, okay? Jesus is Capernaum and he's going out and about. And you're happened to back there in time. You got out your time machine, you're walking around. And I wonder if you'd recognise him as he walked by. Probably when you got talking to him, if you did that. But would he stand out from everybody else?
He was a very ordinary man. And I think that is some of the incredible thing about him. He was an ordinary guy. And remember, he came onto the scene at a time when there were lots of messiahs rocking up and saying that they are the deliverer of Israel. He wasn't the only one who was given the tag of Messiah. He just happened to be the only one who made the claim and then validated his claim by rising from the dead. The others didn't. It would be nice to go back and actually really understand what that time would have been like. what it would have been like to live and move amongst those people, what it would have been like to see exactly how they did things. One of the things that both you and I think, agree on is that the ancient people were not stupid people. They were very, very advanced in so many areas. And I think that it is a proud and foolish thing for us to sit here in the 21st century and look back on people 6,000 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago, and go, no, those poor, stupid people. What absolute nonsense. These were inspired men and women, I'm sure, but history records predominantly the men. Inspired men, inspired people who have brought so much to us over the years. And we lose contact with that because we think that the world gravitates around us. And it so doesn't.
Oh, so an interesting thing then. So the year 1 AD, I guess what we have to do is consider what's the next one we're going to do.
We'll toss it around, pick a date on your calendar.
Sweet. I'll do that. I'll ring it round, make it a red letter day.
You do that.
All right then, boy.
Lovely. Good to see you. Take care, mate.
Ta-ta for now. Take care.